If you think anything about your own government, well, do the best you can, because this is yours.
Our Creek Nation is viewed as being a sovereignty. As such, our government is limited by only two provisions.
This meeting of the Mvskoke Creek National Council will now come to order. We'll stand for our invocation by Second Speaker Helen Chupko.
Long before the white people came to this country, my people, the Muscogee people, had settled in the southeastern region of North America. And by the time these white newcomers began struggling to establish themselves along the eastern seaboard, a powerful Indian confederacy already existed there. The dominant force of this confederacy was the Muscogee tribe, known to the white man as Creeks, because their towns were clustered along the streams and rivers that snaked through the land. From the ancient times, the Creek Nation has governed itself, repeatedly proving to be quite capable of the task. The form of government changed through the time because of successive crises thrust upon the Muscogee by the white man's government. But the determination to remain a vital, distinct people has continued unchanged. Let us now examine the development of the Creek Nation's government as it suffered through removal to Indian Territory, the white man's Civil War, and the creation of the state of Oklahoma. It's a sad story at times, but one of strength and determination as well, and it culminates in the reality of a revitalized, active Creek Nation facing the challenges of the 1980s. Originally, the Muscogee Confederacy occupied most of what is now Alabama, Tennessee, Florida, and Georgia. Warm, rich, green lands, abundant with the necessities of life. The tribal town was the basic unit of government then and the source of strength for the nation. The town was the center of political, ceremonial, recreational, and social life of the people, and that life was directed by the town chief, or Miko, and his council of clans. General nationwide councils were held periodically, composed of all the respected men of the tribal towns. The town of the principal chief was the capital of the Confederacy. The councils were held in different towns at different times depending on the nature of the business to be acted upon. There once had been a great town named Okmulgee on the river Okmulgee. It was hallowed ground because it was recognized as an ancient town settled by the Muscogee after they migrated to this land from the far west. It was there in Okmulgee, or a town like it, the Confederacy began, uniting the Muscogee people with their neighbors, the Yuchi, Hitchita, Alabama, Dogobachis, and many others. But the new Americans' drive for westward expansion forced the Creeks to give up their homelands little by little. This pressure from the outside also created strife within the Confederacy, and the once mighty Creek Nation began to weaken. The Creek War, or Red Stick War, of 1813 and 1814 was a severe blow to the nation, and the removal treaty of 1832 forced the Muscogee people to move to new lands west of the Mississippi River. My people have never forgotten that this removal treaty guaranteed that there would be no further intrusion by the federal government. It was written, "The Creek country west of the Mississippi shall be solemnly guaranteed to the Creek Indians, nor shall any state or territory ever have a right to pass laws for the government of such Indians, but they shall be allowed to govern themselves." By 1838, all the Creek people had been voluntarily or forcibly moved to the Indian Territory. The industrious Muscogee, weakened by their long journey, slowly began to rebuild their nation in the unfamiliar land. The chiefs and councilmen continued to discharge their government duties in the new tribal settlements. By 1840, they were holding general councils again. A tree-covered hill centrally located in the Creek territory was selected as a council ground. Near the summit of the hill, a spring bubbled up, and the place received the name Weagawaholwe, High Spring. A log council house was constructed there, and tribal legislators camped nearby with their families during general sessions. These lawmakers passed laws as needed to guide the people and modified the structure of the government as the situation called for it. Schools were built, blacksmith shops opened, and the nation began to flourish again. Then, the white man's Civil War came and ripped the nation apart once again. Meddling Union and Confederate agents divided the Creek Nation into loyal and Southern factions, a rift that was a long time in healing. Each faction recognized a different man as principal chief, and each chief directed a separate government. But shortly after the war, the two chiefs agreed to reunite the tribe and dissolve the northern and southern factions. Most of the year of 1867 was spent in revising the government and developing a written constitution. Since the council house at High Spring was destroyed during the war, most of the constitutional revision work was carried out at Blackjack Grove on the south side of Deep Fork River. It was there on October 12th that a new constitution and code of laws for the United Muscogee Nation was unanimously adopted. It was a solemn and dramatic occasion. Former opponents, progressives and conservatives, old-time chiefs, and young educated men debated long and earnestly. The brief document began with a preamble resembling that of the United States Constitution. It created a legislature known as the National Council, composed of the House of Kings and the House of Warriors, reflecting the two houses of the old Confederacy. There was an elected principal chief and a second chief whose duties were similar to those of an American governor. 6 district court judges were elected by the voters and 5 Supreme Court justices were appointed by the council. And their legal decisions were enforced by 6 companies of 5 light horsemen each, elected by the voters. A permanent capital site was selected by the council on the old town grounds of Hitchity Town on the north side of the Deep Fork. The place was named Muscogee after the ancient town of the Muscogee Confederacy, and because a similar word in the Muscogee language, Omulgan, means for everybody. In 1878, this stone council house was built. The affairs of the nation were directed from this location until 1907, when all tribal governments in the Indian Territory were disrupted and the state of Oklahoma came into existence. Robert Trepp of Creek Nation's Government Policy and Research Department explains what happened to tribal government in 1907 and the following decades.
After Pleasant Porter was elected to a 4-year term under the 1867 Constitution, his second term in 1903, he died in office in 1907 while the tribe was getting ready for its elections again. Modi Tiger, who was second chief, under the Constitution, he became principal chief. And 3 days later, he received a telegram from President Theodore Roosevelt announcing that he had been appointed to the position of principal chief. And under that appointment, he served a period of 10 years. And this began the era of the appointed chiefs. There was no legal authority for this. There was nothing in the 1906 Act or in any of the Creek agreements that provided for this. This was something the United States did all by itself without any legal authority at all. 3 more men served under these appointments up until the time of Herbert Hoover in 1930. And under Hoover, it got so bad that 2 men were appointed chief during his term for the period of 1 day. Their only duties on those days was simply to sign deeds for tribal lands or tribal interest in lands. Under Franklin Roosevelt, this whole process changed and the Creek people became involved, but it wasn't really an election process. The Bureau of Indian Affairs sponsored a vote by the Creek people, and men could file for the office of principal chief. And whoever got the most votes was considered the Creek people's nominee. Not their elected chief, but their nomination for chief. And then the President of the United States reserved the right to appoint someone else if he felt that was necessary. Now, that did not happen during this period. But there were about 6 or 7 different people between the time of Franklin Roosevelt and the time when John Kennedy became president that served in this way, that served as the nominee of the Creek people and the appointment of the President of the United States. Again, in the 1960s, this practice died out, and it wasn't practiced anymore. And in 1970, Congress passed an act which allowed the 5 civilized tribes, the Creeks and the other 4 tribes in eastern Oklahoma, to elect their principal chief. And the first election was held in 1971. So this whole era between 1907 and 1971, the Creek people participated in different ways in their tribal government. For a while, there was a group called the Creek Mass Meeting, which was simply an assembly of people that were interested in tribal affairs and wanted to participate. There were different groups known as the Creek Council or the Creek Indian Council. Some principal chiefs appointed their own advisory councils. Some principal chiefs tried to call elections from the tribal towns, but none of these elections were ever really representative of all the Creek people. The most tribal towns that ever participated in one of those elections was, I believe, 23 or 24 tribal towns. In 1971, the Bureau's regulations said that whoever got the most votes, they didn't need a majority, whoever got the most votes would be principal chief. And Claude Cox was elected in 1971. Chief Cox established a Constitution Committee that did some work in developing a new Constitution. He established a Constitution Commission several years later, which did further work, held hearings, and developed extensive reports. And in 1975, the National Council received their proposal and amended it and adopted it for submission to the people. Also in 1975, Chief Cox was re-elected to a 4-year term, this time with a majority of votes. In 1976, a lawsuit involving the nature of the Constitution and the nature of all these laws and appointments I've just talked about was decided in the U.S. Court for the District of Columbia. And this established the Constitution Commission, which did its work in 1977 and 1978.
In the 1970s, we witnessed a gradual return of the power of Indian nations. The Creek Nation, in particular, moved rapidly toward constitutional government and self-determination. Virginia Thomas was one of the appointed members of the Constitutional Commission and explains what happened next in tribal affairs.
The commission was created by the action from a lawsuit. It was Allen Harjo and plaintiffs versus Thomas Klepp and defendants. In a civil action, number 74-189 in the U.S. District Courts in the District of Columbia on September of 1976. Thus, the judge, after handing down his opinion and reviewing for a long time, gave this order that they should, the plaintiffs and the defendants should meet, and the 2 representatives from the defendants, 2 representatives from the plaintiffs, and they should nominate, call for nominations and elect a chairperson. Therefore, there were many weeks of screening, talking with, and talking about the nominations, and they finally came to a conclusion on September the 20th of 1978. The Constitution Commission first drafted a format of giving information about the ratification and the referendums ordered in this court. And one was to, of course, bring up to date and fuse those 3 differences into the Constitution drafted on May the 24th, 1976. Thus, we held hearings in news media in every form.
The court's discussion on page 1146 says the commission shall prescribe that voting on each of the 3 questions shall be in the alternative, and your ballot only presents 1 question, not 3 questions. And will also have the precise responsibility for approving the precise wording of the 3 questions to be determined by the vote. I think the court's made it very clear that we have to
present 3 questions to the voters, and each question has to be an alternative. Shall it be this, or shall it be this?
To put it shortly, this whole process was controversial, of course, based on the nature of the suit and the order which came from that. But it was controversial in the meetings as well as in the hearings, and it was the mail-outs and the various documents with which we had to deal with, and the spending of the money that was allocated for this process of drafting a new constitution.
So all I'm suggesting, Robert, is that right here by the answer, put 1867 by one, proposed by the other, and likewise on these 2. That's all.
Instead, right at the end of each phrase, why don't we put the important word in Creek?
What word? 1867?
No, that would not solve anything.
They would be confused.
Put tribal town in Creek, put geographic district in Creek, put 1 house in Creek, put 2 houses in Creek, put,
That doesn't tell you out of which constitution these provisions come from, though. You're only interpreting the answer.
you are assuming that our people want a monolithic type of vote on this thing. And if you had looked at the sample ballots which were returned to the commission by some of our voters, you would see that they're not all going Harjo's way on the 1867 Constitution.
How would you know?
And they are not all going Cox's way on the proposed Constitution. Our Creek people are intelligent people. They are splitting their ballot. They are voting different ways on different issues.
Everything, every facet of it, even the staff selections were controversial, but at the same time, the result was what counted in this, and I think as we go along, it had become better as we ended. On October the 6th, 1979, it was ratified. The results were in favor of the Constitution being ratified by an even 200 votes.
And so the new Constitution of the Muscogee Nation came into being. It is the document which forms the foundation for the current government of the nation. It begins, under the guidance of the Almighty God, our Creator, we the people of the Muscogee Nation, to promote unity, to establish justice, and to secure ourselves and our children the blessings of freedom, to preserve our basic rights and heritage, to strengthen and preserve self and local government, in continued relations with the United States of America, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the Muscogee Creek Nation. So my people have patiently endured, and now once again we are rebuilding our nation on a firm foundation. The path ahead is not smooth and the way is not clear, but together we are striving to form a more perfect union.
If you think anything about your own government, well, do the best you can, because this is yours.
Our Creek Nation is viewed as being a sovereignty. As such, our government is limited by only two provisions.
This meeting of the Muscogee Creek National Council will now come to order. We'll stand for our invocation by Second Speaker Helen Chupko.
"1979 was an important year for the Creek Nation. That year, the Muscogee people ratified a new constitution that would be the foundation for the operation of a strong tribal government. The Creek Constitution begins with a preamble resembling the United States Constitution. Then, the document goes on to define the Creek Nation and the terms of citizenship. Then it breaks the powers of government into three familiar branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. Gary Brashears, executive director of the tribe, explains the executive powers of the government.
The Constitution of the Mvskoke Creek Nation clearly places all executive powers within the office of the principal chief. Legislation passed by the National Council must be forwarded to the office of the principal chief for approval. In addition, the executive branch is responsible for carrying out the legislation and policy that is passed by the National Council and approved by the principal chief. Now, due to the importance of the positions of principal chief and second chief, both of them are elected at large by the Creek Nation voters. The qualifications for both the principal chief and the second chief include they must be 30 years of age or older, must be at least 1/4 blood quantum of Creek Indian blood, and must have lived within the boundaries of the Creek Nation for at least 1 year. In accordance with the Muscogee Creek Constitution, the principal chief is to organize and create the executive office with the advice and consent of the National Council. In 1971, when Claude Cox was elected chief, he began putting together the executive branch that within 10 years became one of the most productive tribal governments within the United States. And about the 1981 fiscal year, the present National Council did adopt the creation and the organization of the executive office as submitted by the principal chief. The day-to-day operation within the executive branch is carried out in four basic organizational components. The first is the Office of the Treasury, which deals with tax and cash management, deals with payroll services. The Office of the Treasury is headed by the Controller, who is appointed by the principal chief and confirmed by the council. The Office of Independent Agencies deals with the different boards of the Creek Nation, the Board of the Housing Authority, the Board of Health Affairs, the Board of Economic Affairs, the Election Board, and the Citizenship Board. The third unit within the executive office is the Office of Justice, and the Office of Justice provides legal counsel to the tribal organization. Any contracts that the Creek Nation has with any attorney to provide these services must have the approval of the council. And the fourth organization is referred to as the Office of the Administration. In the Office of Administration, it provides the support services for the entire tribal complex and organization, and also provides the day-to-day program activities. In taking the oath of office, the principal chief promises to uphold the Creek Constitution. One of the many things involved in the Constitution is the annual delivery of the State of the Creek Nation address. This address usually outlines some of the progress that we have made during the last year, and also looks ahead to priorities for the future.
I, Claude Allen Cox, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of principal chief of the Muscogee Nation, and will to the best of my ability uphold the Constitution Constitution of the Muscogee Nation. Now our government must grow in new ways. The installation of this National Council, provides legitimate representation for the Creek people. For the first time since the National Council was dismissed in 1907, we must now put aside our difference and unify behind the elected National Council. Whatever our destiny may be, it will be determined by the National Council. We must allow the decisions of the Tribal Council to replace decisions by federal courts, and we must unite behind those decisions because they are our own. One characteristic of our people is their will to rebuild. Our nation has rebuilt itself countless times in the past. After De Soto's invasion in 1540, after Andrew Jackson's invasion in 1814, after our move from our homelands in the South, and after the tragedies of U.S. Civil War, and after the allotment of our lands, and after the suppression of our tribal government. Each time our people have recovered and have rebuilt, have progressed in the ways we choose for ourselves. The tragedy of suppression of our tribal government is ended. Rebuild our nation is our mutual responsibility. Thank you.
Kenneth Childers, Speaker of the National Council, explains the nation's legislative powers.
The National Council is the legislative body of the Creek Nation. They're like the Senate of the United States government. There is one house made up of 8 members from geographic districts, as referred to in the boundaries of the Creek Nation of 1900. In the original 1867 Constitution, there was 2 houses, a House of Warriors and a House of Kings. But that was voted out in this 1979 Constitution. A council member will serve 2 years. And he must be over 18 years of age and be a full citizen of the Creek Nation. And he cannot be during his term of office, he cannot be an employee of the Creek Nation nor hold an appointed office. The Speaker of the House is elected by the council to preside over the council meetings. And he cannot vote except in case of a tie. And then there's a second speaker who presides in the absence of the speaker. The council has the power to legislate on all matters important to the Creek people, as long as there is no conflict with the United States Constitution. These include the health, safety, education, and welfare of citizens. The National Council authorizes all expenditures from available funds for tribal purposes. For example, all your federal contracts have to be approved by the National Council. And all of your appropriations for operating the tribal government will be authorized by the National Council. An ordinance, when it comes to the council, it comes in a resolution form. All right? The council will either adopt it and then pass it on to the chief for his approval or disapproval. If he disapproves, then he has 10 days to get it back with his reasons to the council. The council can override his veto with 2/3 vote. But he has 10 days to do this, and if he doesn't do it, then it's automatically an ordinance. The first council under the 1979 Constitution was inaugurated in January of 1980. And a removal ordinance was presented in March. It was ignored by the council. Then it says in the Constitution where all expenditures will have to be authorized by the council. The council wouldn't authorize the chief to spend any money. So our Creek Nation was at a standstill. So we lost $6.6 million in housing alone because the council boycotted a joint meeting of the council and the housing authority. So a recall committee was established. They got the required petitions from 3 districts and took it to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau said they would remain neutral in this cause. It was a tribal matter. So they brought it back to the chief. Then the recall committee hired an attorney who went back to Judge Bryant, who gave us our Constitution in the first place. And then he got up there and he decided that it was a tribal internal matter, that we were a nation and he had no jurisdiction over us. So then the recall committee asked the chief to sign a proclamation declaring these seats vacant and setting an election. And this is what happened.
The judicial powers of the nation are vested in the Supreme Court and other inferior courts. The Supreme Court is composed of 6 appointed judges who serve for 6 years each. Elliott Howe is a Tulsa attorney and is now serving as Chief Justice of Creek Nation Supreme Court.
Our Creek Nation is viewed as being a sovereignty. As such, our government is limited by only 2 provisions. One, of course, is that our government cannot be in conflict with the United States government. And the other, which is equally valid, of equal validity, proclaims that we must abide by our Constitution, which guarantees basic human rights and due process. We might take a lesson from how this has been interpreted by various states, because we are a state. We are essentially a state within a greater state. And the confusion and chaos which exists between state government and federal government certainly means that our fledgling Creek Nation can expect to face many complex problems. Hopefully, the federal government intends to confer the right of self-determination on the Creek Nation. The common good of our people must always come first and prevail. And only constant vigilance ensures that selfish individuals and special interest groups are never allowed to usurp the will of the Creek people. I have had people tell me that this looked like a dual citizenship. I don't think so, because our loyalty is to America. Our goal is to create better citizens. And I am compelled to believe that we recognize this economically. And we must educate our people and so they can live useful lives and be self-sufficient. And self-determination is the answer. It's up to the Supreme Court to keep the Creek government on course with these goals that are set out in self-determination and which are guaranteed by our Constitution.
In some areas, the extent of the powers of the Creek Nation is still unknown. But this Indian nation is making strides toward self-determination and self-sufficiency with pride in its heritage and accomplishments. No matter how far we, the Muscogee people, have come, the work must go on in order to form a more perfect union.